Welcome to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast. I'm back this week with Ben. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Meg. How's it going?
Yeah, I'm all right. Thank you very much. How are you?
All right. We've all been a bit poorly, haven't we, on different occasions, but we seem to be getting close to a clean bill of health. I certainly was a bit ropey a couple of weeks ago, probably the worst thing I've had actually since Omicron back in 2021, but pleased to say, reporting ready for duty.
Good, that's what we need, because it's a busy time of year, and I guess we'll just dig into the stories. Let's start with what I guess the biggest story of the last few days, which is the Herbert Smith Freehills and Kramer live-in Naftalis and Frankel. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but their merger to kind of potentially become a $2 billion law firm with more than 2,700 lawyers worldwide. So that was announced on Monday. It's been the talk of every legal trade publication for the whole week, with a bunch of pieces, reactions, opinion pieces, you name it, everything's been covered. What are your initial thoughts on, well, this merger, but also kind of how it came about in the press?
Yeah, well, let's start with the specifics around the merger. I think, like a lot of people, I hadn't heard of Kramer. I'm not sure you had either, or others. I'm not going to name names, but I was speaking to a very senior legal journalist this morning who hadn't heard of them either until this news. And I asked him, I said, why do you think that is? He said, well, they're a really good firm. He checked them out with people in the States, but they just didn't really have the brand here. But they're apparently a really good firm. And what that says to us, I think, is that we all think here that we know the US market really well because so many sort of big firms are making waves here in really short order. But probably that your big household names are just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
There is a huge market there, and there are lots of firms looking at UK merger partners, which is great. In fact, the podcast that I was last on when you were away with Michael, I was expressing some frustration that while there were all sorts of rumours that no confirmed mergers had happened since A&O Shearman, and lo and behold, here we have one. So it's really, I think it's great, and I suspect that it's going to open the door to a few more. So as we all know, no law firms like to be first mover, but once you have a first mover, you get a second mover, and I suspect there'll be third, fourth and fifth to come. So I suspect it's going to be a busy winter with more transatlantic mergers. In terms of the specifics, so we're not going to sort of dig this up again, but I think all of us admired how A&O Shearman handled their announcement back in May last year on the Sunday, etc., etc. I think all our listeners will be familiar with that. So what's interesting, I think, about this merger is that I'm not quite sure. We don't work with HSF, we don't know them particularly well, but you wonder how many of their partners knew about this before it was announced. So one thing that they did get right is that anybody who works in M&A knows the quicker that you can get the announcement about a potential merger out there, the better, because it makes you keep control of the narrative.
Yeah. And
they've clearly done that here. But my suspicion is there may be some dissenting voices. I thought Paul Hodkinson's editorial as ever was really good, looking at it today, and I think he's quoted obviously an anonymous partner saying it was the first he'd heard of it when he read about it in the media, which was pretty cutting and pretty telling, I think. So my suspicion is that although the merger seems to have been moderately well received, certainly compared to A&O Shearman, which had everybody in raptures, I wonder if we're going to start to see some dissenting voices and some fairly strong objections from partners in both firms. It will be interesting to see how that develops over time.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way this whole thing came about was interesting to me because it somehow feels like they weren't quite ready to announce. And I'm saying this because from a comms perspective, the fact that the Kramer Levin's Paris office, that side of the business would be cut out that came out a day later, I think it was, when really that could have been part of the initial announcement. It's not the news that people want to get, but I guess it's expected in a merger situation anyway that you'd have a kind of headcount reduction at some point. So the whole kind of process of this has been really interesting. Again, the piece in Law.com with various reactions from people across the market, some very positive ones, but again, it's interesting to see that some partners at HSF were kind of like, let's wait and see, and not like entirely enthusiastic. I thought that was interesting. I think people are, happy to have the US component at the firm, and vice versa for the Kramer Lemon side to have a more worldwide kind of presence. But it didn't scream like the ANO one, where people were really looking forward to it, like in the majority, and it kind of feels like a lot of people were kind of taken a bit by surprise. So this was interesting to me. Again, let's see how things move forward. They're going to vote on it sometime in February, and I think they only need 75% of the partner vote. So let's see how that goes early on next year. And I think it should be an interesting way forward. They seem to be really ambitious. The heads of the firms have spoken to Law.com this week. So it's quite an ambitious plan. So we wish them the best, obviously, hoping that that's going to go really well. I'm keen to see what the branding is going to be like when it comes out, because I think that says a lot about it, from as we've seen with Freshfield's rebrand recently. I think it says a lot about, what you want to be presented as and what markets you want to resonate with. We'll see how that goes. I think it's going to be an interesting time in February.
I do think people want mergers to succeed, don't they? They want them to happen. They want them to go well. There is a slight feeling, isn't there? Let's be honest about it. Certainly with A&O and perhaps this, that you want the UK, the sort of heritage UK firm to be seen as the dominant party, right?
Yeah.
And I think it is in this case, and it certainly was with A&O Shearman. So it makes us feel, important and warm and fuzzy and all those things, which is great.
Next up, so today, there's groups of protesters in front of A&O Sherman's office and Akin's office as well in London. They're all climate protesters, and they're, they said that one of the group's lawyers are responsible, LAR, in Fossil Free London. They've said that the firms are fossil fuel industry enablers, and this is a quote from Law.com. So it's interesting. I mean, it's coming in the middle of COP29, obviously, so I think that might have prompted this sudden protest. They might, move around. Clearly, they've targeted those firms because they ranked badly in a recent report by the Students for Climate Accountability. So it's not impossible that they might visit some other firms in the coming days or weeks.
If your law firm name begins with B, watch out, because we've got Akin and A&O Shearman here, regardless of the fact they're in the same building.
B or C, you might be next week. We don't know.
Yep.
But, so I think this is interesting to me. We haven't had a protest in a long time, actually, for a law firm. So it's coming back for sure. I mean, again, this is a kind of thing where you want, for the comms teams listening to this, it might be something to do with internal comms and potential client comms if you are expecting any clients to visit you in the office. I mean, these people are not dangerous, but clearly it's not ideal to access the office. The firms that they visited today did not provide any comment at the time of the publication of the Law.com article. I think it's interesting. We'll see if they visit someone else and if those firms actually put out any sort of statement. And it just puts into, it just highlights the fact that there's more and more young lawyers, especially because these are lawyers protesting today, that are very keen to hold firms to account and to really be careful in the types of work they take on. We've got a great blog that came out today, actually, by our colleague Ben Durkin. It's on our website if you guys want to check it out, but it's exactly about this topic. So clearly it is at the front of the minds of young lawyers. They really care about this stuff, and I guess every client needs legal representation for any type of work, but I guess firms might have to be a bit pickier in the future.
So I remember reading this report back in June, and you've got 42 firms managed to get the F score, including a whole bunch of household names, mainly US headquartered firms. So there's a bit of a glib comment about beginning with A, but I might have a glimmer of truth there. Well, I think one thing that it just taking a step back a bit, so second shameless plug for Byfield activity in 5 minutes. So there's a huge IBA conference in London next week looking at building the law firm of the future. And there is a panel of which I'm fortunate enough to be sitting, looking at decisions around decision-making processes about who law firms act for and who they don't. And I think this piece is linked to that. There are two schools of thought, aren't there? One cynical and one optimistic. The optimistic one is that law firms are seriously taking a step back and trying to create almost like a framework of ethics for deciding who they act for and who they don't. The other cynical school of thought is law firms are taking a step back and saying, oh my goodness, how do we justify acting for this group of clients? How do we build a narrative that makes it okay?
Yeah.
And the difference between the two might seem a little bit, in reality, quite narrow, but in reality it's very, very, very different. And I think fossil fuels is a case in point. Most law firms who act for fossil, big oil or fossil fuel companies will say, well, we're acting for them not because of the old chestnut that everyone deserves legal representation, because we're helping them on a journey to greater sustainability and etc.
Which is often true, to be fair.
Yeah, until you start acting for a huge oil company against climate change groups, litigation, then it slightly is a bit tricky, isn't it? So I think this is part of that. And what is interesting is that this is a group of lawyers protesting. It's not
it's not randos and
people sellotaping themselves or whatever they do to the pavement.
Yeah, so it's going to be reasonable.
Yeah, and I think it is difficult to comment from a PR perspective. No comment always is a bit of a slightly reluctant position, isn't it? And I think they probably got it right here. I don't really know what you could say in the context of this. They have obviously been singled out, and as I said, there's a long list of firms that are considered to have the lowest grade. I'm not quite sure of too much of the science behind it. But yeah, I think it's probably quite important to say that you hope that the protests remain peaceful and in the right spirit.
And I'm sure it will.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm sure it will.
I think so. But I think anything that shines a light on, law firm behaviour and codes of practice and all that sort of thing is not necessarily a good thing, but it just shows that all the efforts that are being made by comms people and leaders into getting all this narrative right is the right thing to do for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
They look quite peaceful. In Jack's piece in law.com, they've got a picture of them. They all look kind of like holding placards up and in a nice, respectful way, nicely lined up. So hopefully it will all be fine.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. Moving on to, should we talk a bit about the US election, actually?
Yes.
That was last week.
Yeah, I think we're not going to get into Trump, so let's not do that. I don't think anybody needs to hear any more on it, and I don't think even if they did, they'd want to hear it from us. But what is interesting from a Byfield and a legal sector perspective, and it really struck me actually, particularly with a couple of pieces in law.com, is the amount of big household name firms that were primed to get involved either on a pro bono basis or on a paid basis with whatever litigation people were expecting to arise out of the result. Thankfully, there doesn't seem to be any, but two things strike me. One is the sheer number of firms. I mean, you're talking a dozen or so, potentially more. And of that dozen and potentially more, the vast majority were aligning themselves to the Dems, the I was going to say the Liberal Democrats, the Democratic Party. And I think if you reversed it, two things are true. One is big law in this country is nowhere near the centre of politics as it is in the States. And the sense I get is that while all law firms will stress their neutrality, I would have thought that they are slightly more Tory leaning than Labour leaning, particularly after all the tax stuff over the last few weeks. So I was really struck by the law firms nailing their colours to the political mast, largely the Democrats, and the fact that they're so close to the seat of power. And maybe it's because, route to leadership in the States is advantageous if you're a lawyer. Bill Clinton springs to mind, and others, perhaps more so than here.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting to me is the fact that firms here in the UK tend to, even if they act for the government and things like that, or some of the people might have been in government at one point or another, they tend to want to really stay separate from all of that, whereas firms in the US don't really mind having an association with a particular party or with the government. It seems to me that the mentality around this is very different, so it's fascinating. But a couple of points for me for the US election. Firstly, it's interesting to me in terms of the rule of law, because they've obviously just elected someone who's a convicted felon on 34 counts. And who's just appointed someone who's being investigated for, child sexual abuse to his government. And, I think for such a litigious country where litigation just thrives in the US, I wonder if there's going to be maybe some kind of doubts from clients across the world about litigating in the US, whether they will lose faith in the justice system in any kind of way, whether that's, domestically and just for, day-to-day access to justice in normal cases, or if it's more kind of business type of litigation. So I think that's really fascinating. What the message that it sends to that community in particular, I think is quite something. Not to say that other leaders in the world are not equally dodgy, but I think that sends a really, really clear message. And I don't know how if that would have any impact. So I think that's the first point. And I think I forgot my second point.
While you're remembering it, I did say this to you off air, but your president, who I do like, Monsieur Macron, in his address to Trump, his statement, he said, President Trump is a man of many convictions, which obviously means something a little bit different in French. And it must, because his English is excellent, isn't it?
Yeah.
He must have done it slightly tongue-in-cheek, and it was brilliant.
He doesn't seem thrilled about the result, if I'm being honest, but, I'm not going to speak for him, but he hasn't seemed, really thrilled in the last week, so, I completely forgot my second point, so we'll just move on, that's fine. Obviously, the Times in the last couple of weeks has put out quite some sensationalist stories around the legal industry. I mean, these are the types of stories that have been done before, so I'm surprised that they're doing it now, but they were all that kind of, cultural issues in big law, and, surprise, high salaries, but, very little time for external enjoyment, lots of, some people reported things, and to be fair, these were issues from over 10 years ago around, misconduct in the office and, use of drugs and whatnot. Some of these things were quite sensational, as I say, but it's interesting that they're looking at it now, and the salaries is the key piece here that I think triggered all of these stories from the Times. Especially for the young lawyers. What did you think of these?
So really sobering, but not for the reasons that you think I'm going to give, more from a comms perspective. So this headline in the Times, I'm just going to read it. It says, I'm 26 and I earn 140k. My perks, burnout and bullying bosses. That, in a nutshell, is all most people want to know about the legal profession. They're not interested in the business of law, the legal sector in and of itself, outside our bubble of the legal press, to a lesser extent the FT, Bloomberg, Reuters, etc. That's it in a nutshell. That's, if you don't look at those things, that's all you're going to read about the legal profession, and I think that's really sad. You know, it's incredible, really. This was in the Times too. There was two articles. There was one on the weekend, and one I think it was on Wednesday. Yeah, and that's kind of it. Yeah, obviously the Herbert Smith Freehills merger got a little bit of coverage, and you know the Times has its law section and everything else. But it makes me sad sometimes that it's this kind of stuff which makes huge headlines and generates massive pieces, etc., rather than the business of law. I do actually think that some of the stuff actually was quite old. Yes. It was quite tawdry, and it was a little bit sensationalist. We all know about the issues raised within the piece. We've been through that in different shapes and sizes many times. But I do think it's time to take a step back. So you'll remember when KWM went down here. It must have been a decade or so ago. Maybe you weren't writing then, but I remember talking to the business editor of this Evening Standard, who I was quite chummy with at the time. He's now doing other things. And it was as KWM were going down, and I said to him, why don't you write this story? It's Shakespearean, it's a whole firm disintegrating in just a matter of a couple of months. And he said, no one's really interested in the legal sector. There's too many firms. They all seem to be doing the same thing. It's quite hard to get your head around. And I'm not quite sure how far we've moved from that, in a decade, to the business press, to the mainstream media. I think our profession is basically defined by overworked, stressed people earning absolutely shed loads of money that they've got no time to spend. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's sad.
That's the key thing, and when there's so much more that could be said, and especially the Times is interesting because they do put out a lot of court cases that are going on and outcomes and whatnot, so it could appeal to a bunch of, to a wide audience if they actually highlighted a bit more of some of the good things that some of the city lawyers are actually doing. Because I get it, the city is not everything, it's such a big industry, right? But some of the stuff that they do, especially on the pro bono side, is properly interesting. And sometimes I just wonder, I think a lot of the time journalists are just after something slightly sarcastic and negative because that's what gets clicks, right? A headline like this, like they have this weekend, and this is really what people want to read about. They're just curious. So it's partially driven by the audience. I just think there's more that could be done that's slightly more positive, and if not positive, just fair. Because yes, that's the reality of a lot of places in big law, but actually, there's also a lot of perks too. And for some people, this is the lifestyle that they want. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some people, they can't handle it and they move on to something else, and that's perfectly fine. Some people do it for a couple of years to get a lot of money and move on, and that's perfectly fine too. I just don't think there are problems to address for sure. And there's many ways to address them, and each firm will have their own thing to do. But I just don't think, it could put people off actually joining the legal industry, which I think would be a shame, because it's a key part of, our economy here in the UK and just making the world move forward.
I agree, but I'm almost more worried about the legal profession just looks like a bunch of weirdos, right, doing crazy hours for not much fun and all that sort of stuff. And we are at Byfield, we're at the heart of the profession. It's what we do. It's our working lives. It's our passion. It just makes me a bit sad that that's what people want to read about more than anything.
Absolutely,
it makes me sad.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that happy note.
Yes. Very happy.
Did you remember your second point yet?
No, I can't remember. remember it. Like it was literally in my mind for 3 seconds and then poof, just vanished. So,
save it for next week.
Yeah, probably one for next week. But yeah, thank you for joining me. As always, pleasure. And we'll be back next week for another episode. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so you can follow us on there. And yeah, have a great rest of the week, everyone.
Listening to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.